presentation, Racism as a Mental Health Challenge, an Anti-Racist Counseling Perspective. What I'd like to do in the time that I have this afternoon is talk with you about a pervasive challenge that we have in the United States, something I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is the rise of racism, what I call neo-racism. Racism has been with us, of course, forever, but we've certainly seen in the last few years, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, some really dynamic dimensions of racism that we haven't seen in quite a while. And I'd like to talk about what that means from a mental health perspective and share with you what I call an anti-racist perspective on counseling to counter racism. So I want to start with this afternoon by just contextualizing this. We know that when we think about the contemporary United States, there's a lot related to racism in a contemporary sense. And these pictures, and I'll just go through each one, you're familiar, I'm sure, with many of these pictures in these instances. If we go up, for example, to the upper left-hand corner, we see an African-American male being escorted out of a Starbucks in my hometown of Philadelphia. This happened a couple years ago, where a couple of Black men came into Starbucks, as people always do, and sit down and start to chat. They bought a cup of coffee, but they were just sitting, as people often do. They were seen as a threat, and the police were called, and they were escorted out. They were basically drinking coffee while Black. The middle picture from the New York Daily News, I think speaks for itself. Busted at BARNEYS for being Black. BARNEYS, a very, very high-end store in New York City. Young Black male went in, browsing, minding his own business, and basically was accused of stealing a belt. Why? Just because he happened to be in BARNEYS and he was Black. The picture in the upper right-hand corner, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. There was a young Black woman at Yale University, student at Yale University, who was studying in the commons area of her dorm, fell asleep in the commons area. A white woman who was on her floor opened the door, saw her sleeping in the commons area, and called the campus security. Why? Because she didn't recognize this Black person, and she was obviously up to no good in her perception. The picture in the lower left-hand corner, this woman has been the subject of so many memes. I'm sure you remember Barbecue Becky, as she was known. A white woman in, I think it was Oakland, California, saw some Black people at a outdoor grilling site in a park, grilling at an outdoor grilling site. She thought they were a threat and called the police. The picture in the bottom middle speaks for itself. We know about the whole incidence of blackface in this country. And the picture in the lower right-hand corner is an ad from Gucci. And when I just look at this picture, I just say to myself, what was Gucci thinking? I want to spend a few seconds talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. Almost 3 years ago now, the incident in Charlottesville. And why it's near and dear to my heart is I spent 15 years living in Charlottesville when I taught at the University of Virginia. So this had really special meaning for me to see those white supremacists walking through the grounds of the University of Virginia with Nazi flags and Nazi salutes and chanting "Jews will not replace us." The whole furor around the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, which of course ultimately led to a whole-scale riot in downtown Charlottesville, which unfortunately led to the death of a young woman. The racist, not only undertones, but overtones of this were really frightening to watch back in the summer of 2017. You all have, I'm sure, become very familiar with the Central Park Five, even though this happened, quote unquote, a long time ago now, back in the 1980s, when 5 teenagers, 4 African American and 1 Latino, teenage boys were in Central Park and were unjustly accused of raping a white woman who was out jogging. This has gotten a lot of attention lately, largely because of Ava DuVernay's brilliant film, When They See Us, where it really underscores institutional racism in its most prevalent form. So racism is really pervasive in our society, which leads me to two questions that I've been grappling with and thinking about a lot. And the first question is, has the US collectively as a country been traumatized by racism? And is racism a health problem or a social problem? And I think we know the answers to these questions, but these will provide context with what I want to talk about this afternoon. I want you all, just for a minute, we don't have enough time to really do this when I do actual workshops on this. This is usually a very, very powerful piece. I want you basically to just think about these four questions. I want you to think about, what was your earliest experience with racism? Just sort of reflect on that. Where did this experience happen? And what impact did this experience have on you? And the last question is, does this experience still have an impact on you today? So just reflect on that for a minute. If you grew up in this country, whether you are a person of color or a white person, it's kind of difficult not to reflect on these four questions and have some visceral response to them. So I want you to, we won't share any of those in the interest of time, but I want you to just think about your own earliest experience with racism and how it impacted you then, and if in some way it still impacts you today. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about racism? Well, we need to understand that we need to conceptualize racism at both an individual level and an institutional level. And when we talk about racism at an institutional level, what we are talking about, as you all know, are the beliefs and the attitudes and the actions of individuals that either support or perpetuate the belief that one racial group is superior to another. And that's what racism is. The people believe, they have attitudes, or they act in a way that basically they believe that their racial group is superior to others. That's at an individual level. Now, if we take these beliefs and these attitudes and we see them expressed in the practices of social and political institutions, then what we're talking about is institutional racism. So individual racism is basically what we see, those beliefs, attitudes of individuals, and then at an institutional level is when we see these attitudes and beliefs expressed in how social and political institutions basically operate. But what's really important to understand about racism is that racism is an ideology. And many times this is overlooked. We just think about racism in terms of racist acts. But we often fail to understand that there's a real ideology behind racism. So one of the things that really, really underscored this for me, and this is a book that I highly recommend to you. It's a book called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, who is a professor of history at American University here in Washington, D.C. And this is one of the most profound books, I think, of the last 20 years or so. Stamped from the Beginning, the definitive history of racist ideas in America. Where did the acts, the behaviors really come from? Well, they stem from an ideology, from some racist ideas that really go back through the history of this country, even before the country became a country. And one of the things that Kendi does in this book is really look at, explore the history of racist ideas through the history of the country. And he does it by looking at racist ideas, or the racist ideology, through the eyes of 5 people, the ideas and the writings of 5 people. These five people are really the guides through his book to really help us look at the history of racist ideas in America. And the five people are Cotton Mather, who was a 16th century religious leader, one of the founders of religious thought in the United States. The second person is Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. And I think we all know about Thomas Jefferson's racist notions because he wrote a lot about it. The third of the tour guides is William Lloyd Garrison, who was a very, very famous abolitionist in the middle of the 19th century. The fourth guide is W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American intellectual, who wrote extensively about what he called the problem of the color line in the United States. And the fifth tour guide through these ideas is Angela Davis, who is a brilliant, who's still with us. The other ones are gone at this point. But Angela Davis, who first became famous in the 1960s, and who really gave drive to intellectual thought around Black nationalism in the 1960s, and is still writing and active today. So these five people basically help us contextualize racist ideas or racist ideology in the United States pre the founding of the country. Now, what's really interesting is that Kendi in this book talks about the fact that if we look at racist ideology, we can see three ideological positions on race and racism. There is a segregationist ideological position, an assimilationist position, and an anti-racist position. Now, if we look at if we explore, as Kendi does in this book, explore racist ideology over the last 200 plus years of this country, you'll find segregationist, assimilationist, and anti-racist ideological positions. The segregationist ideological position is the racist position. If we look at the segregationist ideological position, what this posits is that why are Black people inferior? Why do we have racial disparities in this country? Well, it's because Black people are inferior and they are responsible for their racial disparities. And if we look at writings and ideas across 250 plus years, we can see this segregationist racist idea that Black people are inferior, Black people are responsible for racial disparities. The second ideological position that Kendi has explored in racist ideology in the United States is the assimilationist position. And that is that Black people and racial discrimination are responsible for racial disparities. That basically Black people are inferior and they are racially discriminated against. That is the reason why we have racial disparities, is because Black people are inferior and there is racial discrimination. What this position really sort of implies is that Black people need to, which is why it's called the assimilationist position, is that Black people need to assimilate. Black people need to try to become as much like white people as they possibly can. If they assimilate and become like white people, then we will see these racial disparities disappear. The final position that Kendi talks about in this book, he calls the anti-racist position. And this is the one that we're really going to focus on. Why do we have racial disparities in this country? It's because we have racial discrimination. That basically Black people and other people of color are discriminated against on the basis of their race. They are not inferior. There is nothing wrong with them. It is the fact that they are discriminated against, that we have large dimensions of not only individual racism, but more importantly, we also have institutional racism as well. So if we look at the history of knowledge and epistemology in the last 250 years of American thought, you can see these three ideological positions on race. And Kendi does a brilliant job of really looking at leading thinkers in this country and how their ideas, their ideology falls into one of these three areas. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this with you, but I want to show you sort of what this looks like. What Kendi has done is he's looked at how we can see these three racial ideologies in religion, anthropology, biology, arts and literature, and also in psychology. And he talks about these in the book. And very quickly, I'm just going to talk about arts and literature. And if we look at arts and literature in the history of the United States over the past 250 plus years, we can see each of these ideologies in our arts and our literature. For example, we can see the assimilationist position that basically if Black people become like white people, everything will be okay if they assimilate. For example, you can see this in the poems of Phyllis Wheatley. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, but she was a freed slave who lived in Boston back in the 1700s. And she became very, very famous because she was taught to read and write. And she basically took on the language of the white aristocracy of the time. And if you read her poems, you would not believe that they were written by a Black woman. They basically have the tenor and tone of an educated white woman of the time. It's very obvious that Phyllis Wheatley had assimilated. We also see this assimilationist idea. I don't know how many of you, I'm dating myself here, how many of you remember the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with Sidney Poitier and Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy back in the 1960s. But this is a classic example of how we can see assimilationist ideology in a film. The whole notion of here's this brilliant Black man who was a Nobel Prize finalist who basically falls in love with a white woman. And basically she brings him home to her liberal parents in San Francisco. And the only reason that he is accepted really by her family is because for all intents and purposes, he is a little brown white man. He is really, truly assimilated. So we really see this assimilationist notion in this movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? The segregationist or racist position or ideology can certainly be seen in the things that I've listed there: Uncle Tom's Cabin, Birth of a Nation, King Kong, Tarzan, Gone with the Wind. Birth of a Nation, which was, for all intents and purposes, the first blockbuster movie in the United States. Came out in 1915, and it basically glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. It was based on a book called The Klansman, and D.W. Griffith, who is considered the first great American director, who basically saw the South defeated in the Civil War. And Birth of a Nation, if you ever watch it, it's a silent film, you will basically see Black people portrayed as subhuman, as inferior, and white people as basically seen as the archetype that people are supposed to be like. It's very denigrating of Black people. It was shown in the White House to President Woodrow Wilson, who thought it was a wonderful film. And it was really very, very popular. In fact, it was probably the first blockbuster movie in movie history. I'm not going to talk. King Kong basically has some very, very racist overtones. King Kong, the big black ape, aping after the white woman. Tarzan, I really don't like Tarzan, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about Tarzan. And then we have the movie Gone with the Wind, which in my opinion is the worst movie ever made, but you can talk to me about that later. But it really shows Black people again as being inferior to whites. So we can really see this segregationist notion played out in Gone with the Wind. Then we come to the anti-racist ideology, the one that we really want to focus on. And we can certainly see this in three films, which basically show Black people as being human beings, showing Black people in a very, very positive light. The autobiography of Malcolm X, Spike Lee's classic Do the Right Thing, and most recently, Black Panther. And one of the reasons why Black Panther was as popular as it was and really struck such a chord among Black people is, wow, here are Black people as superheroes. Here are Black people really portrayed in the most positive light you can possibly see. So we see this very, very strong anti-racist ideology running through Black Panther as well as the other two films. Now I want to talk very quickly about how we see these three racial ideologies played out in the discipline of psychology. For example, we can see the segregationist ideology, this whole notion that Blacks are intellectually inferior to whites, in books such as The Bell Curve. The whole notion that, yes, if we look at standardized tests, there's a significant gap between whites and Blacks on standardized tests. And we've thought of all the kinds of reasons why this gap exists. And the only thing that we can think of is that Blacks are intellectually inferior to whites. This was a school of thought from The Bell Curve and some of those other books that were written that basically tried to explain the gap in standardized testing between Blacks and whites, not taking into consideration things like poor schooling, socioeconomic disadvantage, all of those kinds of things. It was just the fact that Blacks are intellectually inferior to whites. Now, the assimilationist ideology can be seen in the Clark-Doll studies, which for most of us who grew up on the Clark-Doll studies, the Clark-Doll studies have always been put up as basically this basically was it was a landmark experience in the history of psychology, because the Clark-Doll studies basically were the basis for the Brown versus the Board of Education decision back in 1954. When Kenneth and Mamie Clark basically showed a group of dolls to poor Black kids in segregated schools in the South, one Black doll, one white doll, and they asked the kids, what doll would you rather play with? Which doll is the prettiest? And in significantly large numbers, these Black kids would pick the white dolls. The Clarks basically concluded from that when Blacks are segregated from whites, they have a low self-concept. So basically they were really pushing for the integration of schools. Now, the problem with this is it's an assimilationist point of view, that basically how is the only way that Black kids are going to do well if they're sitting in class with white kids. That will help their self-concept. We know that is not the truth. In many cases, what happens to Black kids when they're sitting with white kids is just the opposite of that. But certainly we can see this whole notion of let's see if we can assimilate Blacks with whites. Now we see the anti-racist ideology in the work of Black psychology, the work that certainly myself and many, many other Black counselors and psychologists have been involved in for 20, 30 plus years now, that basically we're looking at the development of a Black psychology where we have Afrocentric notions of Black culture and behavior, that basically Black people have their own cultural realities. They basically are no more or less than anybody else's. And basically Black culture, Black behavior is normal. There's nothing pathological about it at all. So this is where we want to see ourselves as counselors and psychologists, with this anti-racist ideological notion, which I'll talk more about as I go along. Okay, that was a lot to throw at you, and I want to make sure I get through all of this. Racism is trauma. Been doing a lot of work around this notion that racism is a traumatic event. We know what trauma is. We know that it's a psychological, emotional response to something, an event or experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. And, people can be traumatized by an awful lot of things. But what we're talking about is racial trauma. That basically what happens when people have real or perceived experience or event of racial discrimination or threats of harm and injury, humiliating, shaming events, or basically any other thing that relates to racism. And we know we have a long history of events, other types of things that have traumatized people of color, particularly African Americans, when it comes to race. So, what does racism do to people? I want to talk now about, and I want to start with racism and the mental health of white people, because usually when we talk about racism, we talk about what racism does to people of color. Now, but I want to start with racism and the mental health of white people and what racism tends to do to white people. Now, does racism traumatize whites? Well, that's still a question, okay? But racism does deeply impact white people. In particular, racism develops what I call negrophobia among white people, which is it's not in the DSM-5, but negrophobia. And negrophobia is generational. We've seen negrophobia across the generation of the white experience in this country when it comes to dealing with particularly black people. And what are some dimensions of negrophobia that we tend to see that impact upon the mental health of white people? First of all, there's racial fragility. Now, I've expanded on a term that was first developed by Robin DiAngelo in her book, White Fragility, which came out a couple years ago, which I strongly recommend that you read. She does a really, really good job of sort of talking about the mental health of white people when it comes to issues of race. But we certainly see negrophobia can basically be seen many times generationally among whites in hostility, in fear, in hypervigilance. And the classic example for me of fear and hypervigilance, we use it all the time. It's kind of a tired story, but it's so true. A white woman gets on an elevator and there's a black male on the elevator, and they're the only two people on the elevator. And what does she do? She right away clutches her purse close to her because of the fact that she's afraid and she's being hypervigilant because she is alone in this closed space with a black man. I mean, we use that all the time to sort of demonstrate what we mean by fear and hypervigilance. Social isolation, with a term that we like to use today, unfortunately, social distancing. Well, we've seen social distancing among whites when it comes to people of color all the time. All we have to do is look at what happens when a black person moves in, and we've seen this all over the country, moves into a white neighborhood and white flight takes place. White people so afraid, negrophobia, so afraid of people of color, of blacks, that they want to socially isolate themselves. They basically want to move as far away from blacks as can. So white neighborhoods become black neighborhoods as whites move out to socially isolate or socially distance themselves. Defensiveness, denial, and guilt certainly a part of this racial fragility. I'm not, quote unquote, I'm not a racist. My family didn't own slaves. There isn't a problem. Or guilt. I feel so sorry as a white person for what's happened to you poor black people. All of these things kind of relate to this fragile dimension of that we see among whites as they are impacted by racism, which is what I call generational negrophobia. But there's a flip side to this, because if we don't see racial fragility, many times what we see is the development of what Adler would call a superiority complex, when whites basically get a sense of privilege or a sense of entitlement, basically because I'm white and basically my culture, my civilization is superior to yours. What we call, what D'Angelo calls white supremacy. And she doesn't mean white supremacy in the sense of those people marching through Charlottesville, even though that's a part of it. White supremacy is this notion that basically white culture, whiteness is supreme. And we see this certainly in colonialism, where European nations, were taking white culture to the rest of the world, so that white culture is in a supreme position, part of this superiority complex. And again, one of the ways that we see whites basically impacted by racism. Now, that isn't really talked about a whole lot, okay? What we tend to see mostly when we talk about racism is we see what racism does to people of color, where we really do see generational trauma. I did this one secondly because we know this already in so many respects in the literature. But certainly what we see with people of color, Black people and other people of color, again, is generational trauma, okay? People of color have basically suffered from internalized devaluation. This whole notion of I am Black, therefore I am not as good as. And this becomes internalized, this devaluation becomes internalized. And we see this in so many actions and behaviors, self-destructive, self-defeating behaviors among people of color, because they have this internalized devaluation of self. We can also see among people of color an example of generational trauma. We certainly see a lot of generalized anxiety disorder, or what Smith calls among African-American college students, but it can be expanded to anybody, racial battle fatigue. The whole notion of every day, if you are Black, you go out into the world and you have to fight a battle based on the color of your skin. And it basically becomes fatiguing. And you suffer from racial battle fatigue. And Smith has written a lot about this in his work with Black college students on white campuses, who basically present many times with generalized anxiety disorder, which is what he calls racial battle fatigue. Clement Von Tress, one of the true giants of the field of cross-cultural counseling, developed a term called historical hostility as a way to talk about the rage that we see so many times among people of color. The question can, why are Black people so angry? Why do Black people burn down their neighborhoods? Why is there so much anger among Black people? Well, Von Tress calls it historical hostility. When you spend generation after generation after generation being oppressed, discriminated against, you get pretty angry. You get pretty angry at the people who are marginalizing and oppressing you. And basically, we've seen this throughout American history, how Black people and other people of color have basically been dehumanized by the prevailing white culture and have built up historically a lot of hostility. Likewise, we certainly see large numbers of microaggressions. Microaggressions were first talked about by Chester Pierce of Harvard University, not Darrell Wing Sue, even though he gets a lot of credit for microaggressions. But microaggressions, those daily, ongoing things that just really gnaw at you and basically contribute to your rage. Things that day after day after day basically just grind you down because you happen to be Black, dealing with racial indignities and racial injustices. And certainly we know that for the mental health of people of color, cultural dysthymia, another term that was developed by Clement Von Tress, this whole notion of low-grade, ongoing chronic depression that basically comes from ongoing chronic marginalization, oppression, devaluing where people become sick and tired of being sick and tired. So this is the way we tend to see racism impacting the mental health of people of color with this generational trauma. So what I want to do now in the time that's remaining, and I probably went a little bit too long on just giving you this background, but I want to talk about some models for counseling from an anti-racist perspective and share with you the work of people like Hardy and Malat Shafley, and some work that I've been doing with a colleague of mine at the Chicago campus of the Chicago school, Makiba Boykins. And I want to share with you some crucial aspects of anti-racist counseling models. What are some things that we need to think about if we want to do counseling from an anti-racist perspective? And this is what these are the crucial components that are important in an anti-racist counseling perspective: cross-cultural counseling, trauma-informed counseling, feminist counseling, narrative counseling, psychoeducational counseling, looking at the biosocial impact of racism on people, as well as the socio-cultural impact of racism on people. So each of these components will be in the models that I'm about to share with you now. So I want to talk about how we counsel people of color from an anti-racist perspective. And this is from some work that Makiba Boykins and I are doing. Let me just very quickly go through the case of Lolade. This is not this young woman's name, but the case is really true. It's what happened at Yale. Lolade is a 20-year-old African-American sophomore at a prestigious university. She is one of a small minority of students of color at the school. She's been referred to the counseling center after an incident in her dorm has left her feeling anxious and depressed. She states that she was confronted by campus security after a white student reported her sleeping in the common area of their dorm. The white student claimed that Lolade looked quote unquote suspicious. Lolade claims that ever since she arrived on the campus, she has felt singled out because she's Black. She senses that both white students and faculty see her as an oddity and treat her as if she does not belong at the school. She's always having to deal with subtle and not so subtle racist remarks and actions. She says that every day she comes back to her room exhausted from dealing with white folks, quote unquote. Because there are so few Black students or faculty on campus, she feels very alone. She's lost all interest in her studies and spends most of her time in her dorm room. This last incident has her considering leaving the school. Okay, so we see racial battle fatigue here. We certainly see cultural dysthymia. There's a lot of microaggressions that have impacted her. So we see all of those kinds of impacts that racism can have on Lolade's mental health. So let me share with you now what I call an anti-racist paradigm for counseling people of color, which has 4 stages, as you can see. Stage 1 is about multicultural and social justice counseling competency. Stage 2 is about the counseling framework that you use. Stage 3 is how you go about broaching race and racism. And stage 4 is the actual intervention that you would use. So let me go through these parts of this paradigm, starting with stage 1. Okay, if you're going to be working in this anti-racist paradigm, you have to exhibit cultural competency. And basically is evidenced by understanding the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies that basically were developed by the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, a division of ACA, and basically were endorsed by the American Counseling Association, which should be a fundamental document, a fundamental understanding of all counselors working in diverse cultural contexts. The second stage is that it's really important that you understand the role of racism in the etiology of your client's concern. That's certainly true in looking at Lolade's case. We know for a fact that racism is really what this case is all about, that there's a biopsychosocial impact here. We have to be able to understand this from a trauma perspective. And we also have to understand some notions that come from feminist counseling. The whole notion that it's not necessarily the individual who really has the problem, it's the system that has the problem. And Lolade is basically reacting to it. In this case, it's not sexism, but it's racism, but it still comes out of the notions of feminist counseling. The third thing that's really important, stage 3, and this goes back to cross-cultural counseling competency, is being able to really lay it out there by broaching with her race and the racial dynamics of this, and encouraging her to talk openly and candidly about race, and the counselor being able to do that as well. Not tiptoeing around it in any way, shape, or form, but really broaching it and bringing out the dynamics of racism and how racism has really been a traumatic dimension in Lolade's life. Then the fourth stage. The fourth stage is really where we go to work in an anti-racist, with an anti-racist perspective. And I call it, well, Boykins and I call it a trauma-informed, racism-sensitive, narrative therapeutic approach. And these are the things that we want to do with this approach. We want to, first of all, explore with her the dimensions of racial battle fatigue and cultural dysthymia. This would be true of Lolade or any client that we were working with. And assess the impact of individual and structural racism on the ideology of the presenting issues or concern. Then really explore with the client the nature and extent of internal devaluation that's been caused by the racism they experience. How deep does this really go? What's going on inside of you, and how have you been devalued by individual and structural racism? And then look at those racial microaggressions that have contributed to this internal devaluation and promoted anger or self-defeating and self-destructive behavior. What are this person's strengths and inner resources, even though we know that they've been traumatized, even though we know that there's a lot of internalized evaluation? What are their cultural strengths and inner resources that can contribute to resiliency and provide a defense against racism? And because this young woman is angry, she's frustrated, explore ways to redirect that anger in ways that will result in personal empowerment. How can you basically channel, we don't want you to leave the school. How can we basically channel this anger and this frustration into ways that you are going to become personally empowered? So this is trauma-informed counseling. It's listening to the client's story. So there's narrative counseling. Again, there's a lot of feminist counseling in this, and there's psychoeducational counseling in this, because we really want to help the client develop skills that will help him or her empower themselves. Let me move on now to counseling white people from an anti-racist perspective. Okay? So this is Becky. Okay, I'm not going to read this case in the interest of time. You're all familiar with Barbecue Becky. She's on the phone because she's calling the police because there's a group of Black people in this park grilling in a barbecue area, okay, which is where you're supposed to barbecue. But she's freaking out because these Black people are going to cause the park to burn down, okay? So let's say we have Becky in counseling, okay? So what does the anti-racist paradigm look like for counseling white people? Again, it's got to start with stage 1 of that multicultural and social justice competency. You've got to really think about a framework that really sort of recognizes, where did Becky get all this stuff? Then we have to get into broaching her fragility, and then what we call an anti-racist, and in this case, a restorative intervention. So stage 1 looks just the same. Stage about social, cultural competency. Stage 2 is really, we need to understand, where did Becky get all this stuff from? We have to recognize the social and cultural factors that really influence the development of her racial fragility. Where did she learn to become afraid of Black people? Where did she develop her negrophobia? And where did it come from? There's some socio-cultural impact on her that basically led to her being, and I'll use the term, traumatized by this whole thing. Then again, broaching with her the fact that, there's some racial fragility here, okay? Talk openly about aspects of your racial fragility, broaching that racial fragility. And then we go into what Boykins and I call an integrative, psychoeducational, narrative, restorative, therapeutic approach. That's a mouthful, but what do we want to do? First of all, it's really important that we explore her stage of white racial identity development, building on the seminal work of Janet Helms. And her white racial identity development model is spot on. We can usually identify where white people are in their racial identity development, and it's spot on where they usually are. So really assess and explore her stage of white racial identity development, explore both her implicit and explicit racial biases, explore and process the extent of her racial privilege and her notions of white supremacy, not in that necessarily a negative sense, but I'm white, I'm privileged because white people are supreme. Explore also any aspects of her racial fragility. It's very obvious that she is a little angry. She's certainly very fearful. She's got this racial fragility. What is she so afraid of? And then explore the intersectionality of her identity development, her biases, implicit and explicit, her privilege, and her fragility. The next thing is to really conduct with her a personal racist attitude and behavioral inventory. Really, what are her attitudes and behaviors when it comes to race? So she really look at them and understand them. But again, because we want to look at strengths, what are some strengths that she has that could be used to really challenge her personal racist ideology? The next step, I think, is really crucial. Why do you want to change? Now that you've seen all this stuff, what's the motivation for you to change, confront and change your racist attitudes and behaviors? And if she can see, yes, I am motivated to change, then basically begin to help her to explore what anti-racist attitudes and behaviors would look like. Okay, I think that's it. So I know I talked a lot, but I think it's time to see if there are questions. So I'm going to need some help with this. Where are the questions?
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Lee?
I see some people I know on, I see their pictures anyway.
You can feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put the questions in the chat.
Oh, you here? Yeah, because they called me to work today. So,
I see, well, let me see if I can open the chat.
So there's a question, Dr. Lee, that Tony Suarez also often gets from his students. What role do we have in changing a client's ideology if it's not part of their presenting problem?
Well, I think that's what we have to, I mean, we can't change their ideology. I mean, the only person who can change their ideology is them. But I think in working on their presenting problem, many times it will delve into their ideology, and hopefully as a byproduct of working on their presenting issue, they will begin to question their ideology. I see somebody said the Clark study was replicated in, oh, this is from Michael Brooks. Hello, Michael. The Clark study was replicated in 2006 and essentially achieved the same results, and that's kind of scary.
There's another question from Jack Simons. He says, are there racist attitude and behavior inventories out there for use in clinical work or with mock cases with students?
Yes, there are a few that I can, if you email me, I can point you to some. They're not really very good, but there are a couple that are out there. So I'll be happy to share a couple of those with you.
Another question that we got was, where does social justice counseling play a role in any of the frameworks you've presented, whether the client adopts the anti-racist, assimilationist, or segregationalist ideas?
Okay, well, if a person adopts a segregationist idea, I think from a social justice perspective, we have a moral and ethical imperative to help them really, or I guess the best way to put it is to challenge that ideology. That's where the social justice piece comes in, because social justice is about, you know, challenging things that are detrimental to people. And somewhat with the same thing with the assimilationist point of view as well.
There's another one from Celeste Gorman. Would you say that it would take a great deal of time with some white clients to understand the idea of whiteness?
Yes, that's a good question. And the answer is yes. One of the things that, in terms of working with white students in multicultural and diversity classes for many, many years, is how, and this goes back to Helms's stages of white racial identity development, how oblivious so many white students are to their whiteness, because again, because they've been in a privileged position in society, or they've lived in a cultural enclave with only other whites, they haven't had to think about their whiteness, quote unquote. So yeah, helping white clients understand the idea of whiteness may be, it might not be as easy as getting a Black client to understand the idea of Blackness, because they kind of have learned that from day one in terms of their life. So yeah, that can sometimes be a challenge.
Dr. Hannah Lanus said, can you please talk about counselor-client match and mismatch and its efforts on success of this work?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Let me talk about the mismatch, because that kind of brings up the question, can a Black counselor work with a white client, or vice versa? I think if it starts with that cultural competency, if the counselor understands himself or herself and has dealt with their own cultural blind spots, I think that's really important, that if they can come across to a client in a very, very real, honest, and open way, not afraid to broach, not afraid to, deal with those tough racial issues, then I think the mismatch won't be such a mismatch, if that makes sense. I know we're sort of running out of time, but I see the questions now. So from Dr. Cole, how might your framework be used to address racism at an institutional level? That's really a very, very good question. I think what we want to do is help clients individually, and I'll speak specifically about white clients, who basically become self-aware, who then become advocates to change the system. I think part of that also is, as counselors, in our role as advocates from a social justice perspective, to also challenge, whenever we see them, those racist policies and ideologies that cause problems. To give you an example, one of the things that I would do if I had been a counselor at Yale University is I would have basically gone to the security office and found a way to work with the security guards there to give them, I don't want to call it racial sensitivity, I hate that term, but some cultural awareness training, so that they would have the sophistication enough and insight enough to really have handled this situation differently. Well, I'm looking at my phone here, and it says 3:55. And if I'm not mistaken, that was my time. That's my time slot, right?
Yes, Dr. Lee.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I think the slide is still up. You can see my email address there. If you have other questions or anything, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee.
You're welcome. And goodbye to everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.